Welcome to the Let's Get Chatting True Crime Deadly Discussions, your trusted source for deep dives into the haunting stories of history's most infamous figures. I'm Josh, and today we're delving into the unsettling life of none other than the main man, Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that continues to evoke both fear and fascination.
Did you ever look up on a computer and do research on psychopaths? Yeah.
Jeffrey Dahmer's story is a compelling yet chilling narrative that remains etched in the records of criminal history. Today, I'll meticulously examine various facets of his life, from his tumultuous beginnings and inner struggles, to the gruesome specifics of his crimes, his psychological complexities, and the societal reverberations that ensued. My aim is to offer a comprehensive understanding of Big JD, Jeffrey Dahmer's world, highlighting the less explored aspects, including his battle with his sexual identity. Before we begin, I should mention that this episode contains disturbing and pretty crazy content. I've spent a little while researching this case, and I'll be honest, there were moments when I personally had to step away, even after watching the series, like just take a minute, because some of the details we'll cover today, I wouldn't say they haunted me for days, but they did stick with me. But I do believe it's important to confront these, like, the difficult realities, and not to like sensationalize them, but to understand the complex factors that create someone like him and what he went through. So, born on May 21st, 1960, in the heart of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer entered a world where the appearance of a typical American family masked underlying chaos. His parents, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, were frequently embroiled in bitter disputes that filled their home with tension and instability. Lionel was a dedicated chemist, often found himself consumed by his professional work and his pursuits, and essentially that left him neglecting his family duties, being a dad, that sort of thing. Meanwhile, Joyce, she grappled with severe mental health challenges such as depression, which led to a reliance on some sort of drugs, prescription drugs, medications, frequent hospitalizations, and erratic behavior. So it left young Dahmer adrift in an emotional sort of unknowing. What strikes me about Dahmer's early family life is how familiar this dynamic is. A workaholic father and a struggling mother. The dad goes to work, the mum stays at home and struggles. Yet the outcome was super extreme, right? Makes you wonder what the point was where a difficult childhood can, the nature or nurture, change him into a killer. We've all spoke to people who have had similar upbringings, and they've had normal lives. So what changed? What was what was at play here, essentially? Lionel was deeply immersed in his scientific endeavors. A profound void grew in Jeffrey's life. He would later express deep regret for failing to address this. Despite his intellectual achievements, he struggled to bridge the emotional divide within his family, inadvertently contributing to Jeffrey's intense feelings of isolation and neglect. Now, this emotional sort of swamp chasm, coupled with his mum's unpredictable actions, it left Jeff feeling abandoned, alone, setting the stage for a darkness that would later consume. As a child, Jeff displayed signs of detachment and introspection, seldom connecting. He wasn't good with connecting with others, and often retreating to be in his own little world. A significant early indicator of his developing pathology was his intense fascination with dead animals. Young Jeffrey, he collected roadkill, meticulously dissecting the remains and preserving them, sort of, like they do with like the moths and all that sort of stuff, but putting them in jars of formaldehyde, which essentially kept them together. It's a practice his father unwittingly encouraged by demonstrating how to clean animal bones. This macabre curiosity foreshadowed a darker side that would eventually manifest in terrifying ways. Now, People have spoken to Jeffrey's childhood friends off the record, and who have described finding Jeffrey's collection of animal bones. And it wasn't just that he had them. They would say that it was just the way he talked about them, like they were treasured. They were his possessions, his gifts. They just sort of, he treasured death, if that makes sense. Like, he treasured deaths, and these disturbing patterns emerged super early. So as Jeffrey entered adolescence, his isolation only deepened. At Revere High School, he became a frequent target for bullies, exacerbating his sense of alienation. Despite these challenges, he occasionally drew attention through bizarre antics, earning the nickname Doing a Dahmer. So this is where it wasn't like typical school pranks. They were a bit weird, bit unsettling. He'd fake like seizures, adopt strange accents, leaving people a bit weirded out. Like Doing a Dahmer was like just essentially acting a little bit weird. These were clearly his way of seeking acceptance in a world where he felt invisible. But instead of like helping him get into a friendship any further, it just made him more of an outsider, because people are like, what is he doing? During this period, he turned to alcohol, arriving at school smashed, pissed up, whatever you want to call it. But it became his refuge, a means to escape. He had feelings of inadequacy, loneliness, and they weighed on him, right? And despite his troubles with alcohol, he graduated in 1978, albeit with no clear direction for his future. His drinking continued to escalate, serving both as a coping mechanism and a precursor to his later crimes. I've often thought about how differently things they would have turned out if someone or anyone would have recognized like what was going on, with his alcoholism. He's so young, man. If someone would have noticed that, they could have spoke to him. We're talking about a teenager who was smashed all the time at school and acting the fucking idiot. If someone would have intervened, they could have changed so much. In this educational environment, that would have definitely been clicked straight away, but back then it was largely ignored. And that sort of represents many systematic failures in the whole Dahmer case. It allowed him to develop a significant yet understated aspect of his life was his sexuality. Growing up in a conservative setting, Jeffrey grappled with his identity, which was a gay man, which turned to the alcohol and all this, which wasn't noticed. So struggling to reconcile with societal expectations, this internal conflict compounded his sense of isolation and possibly fueled his desire for control and possession, which later manifested in his criminal acts. His struggle with his sexuality was a constant undercurrent influencing his interactions and also sort of contributing to his feelings of alienation. What I like to do is emphasize here that Dahmer's sexuality didn't cause his violence tendencies. That's a massive misconception. It's quite harmful to that community, the gay community, the LGBT community. Rather, it was the repression and the shame of isolation that he experienced in a society that wasn't accepted. There's research that people do when people are forced to hide core aspects of their identity. It can create profound psychological distress. And in his case, this was just one of many factors in an already volatile psychological makeup. So, yeah, shortly after graduation, Dahmer committed his first murder. So on June 18th, 1978, he encountered an 18-year-old hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks. Hicks was a friendly young man looking for a ride. He was drawn to Dahmer's offer of beer and a conversation. Back then you'd do that, right? You want a beer? Yeah, let's do. And Dahmer, feeling a mix of excitement and fear, he invited Hicks back to his family home. Under the pretense of socializing, that fateful night, driven by a complex blend of panic, desire for control, and loneliness, Jeff bludgeoned him. He bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell, and he strangled him to death. In the aftermath, Dahmer meticulously dismembered the body, crushing the bones with a sledgehammer and scattering them in the woods. Now, it was behind his house. Now, for Hicks, the family, the pain of his disappearance was agonizing. And Dahmer's later confession brought a grim closure to the years of unanswered questions. People have said who have visited the area where Hicks' remains were scattered, it's just now a quiet suburban development. Most residents don't even have any idea of that what happened. That's what happened. The bones were buried there. Standing in a peaceful neighborhood, but people who know would feel the weight of how like an ordinary setting can conceal such evil. It's a sobering reminder that the darkest chapters of human behavior often unfold in the mundane locations. Wherever you are, something bad could have happened. So following this murder, Dahmer experienced a hiatus in his homicidal urges, possibly due to the guilt and fear that loomed over him. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but his alcohol abuse resulted in poor academic performance, leading to his withdrawal after just one semester. In 1979, he enlisted in the army, training as a medical specialist. However, his service was cut short in 1981 due to alcohol issues. He's basically an alcoholic, you can't get away with it. But he was given an honourable discharge. His time in the military did little to curb his destructive behaviours. And what's fascinating about this is that Dahmer seemed to be searching for structure. University, then he went to the military. I mean, he was trying to fit into conventional society, the social norm. I've wondered if they represent moments when he was fighting against his darker impulses. People who were in the army with him have described him as unremarkable during his time. Like, just, he blended in. How effective he blended in is crazy. Just an unremarkable guy. No one thought about him. He was just meh. So after his military service, Dahmer returned to Ohio before relocating to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. It was during this period that his homicidal impulses began to resurface. Dahmer found solace and anonymity in Milwaukee's gay bathhouses, where he often drugged men to fulfill his fantasies of control. Now, they didn't resist either, because they were gay man. He would just drug them, go to the bathhouses, here's a drug, boom. This behavior eventually led to his ban from several bathhouses, because they were known he was drugging people, right? But this did mark a period where he honed the predatory tactics he would later use. People say when they've walked through the neighborhoods where Dahmer hunted his victims, there's just something a little bit haunting about it. Standing at like those same street corners, seeing the same buildings that he would have seen, and just go like the bathhouses, all that sort of thing. It's just knowing he's done that is crazy. So Milwaukee has changed since then, but many landmarks remain. Now, they're vibrant, bustling areas, like not isolated, what we associate with like these crimes. You think of like dark alleyways, not in the know, but he operated in plain sight, which really speaks volumes about his ability to mask his true nature. So in November 1987, Dahmer's urges resurfaced with intensity. He met Stephen Toomey at a bar, and through a haze of alcohol and desire, Dahmer invited him to share a room at the Ambassador Hotel. Now, you see a lot of this in the documentary. Toomey was a 25-year-old man of mixed race, was known for his kind heart and approachable demeanor. Dahmer later claimed to have awoken to find Toomey dead with no memory. We seen this in the documentary. He just beats him to death and doesn't remember it. No memory of the murder. The dismemberment process that followed was detached and methodical, with Dahmer disposing of the remains as if discarding of sort of like a dark secret or something he wanted to hide. You would, wouldn't you? For Toomey's family, his sudden disappearance was a source of anguish and confusion. The details of his fate remaining a haunting mystery until Dahmer's eventual capture. The Ambassador Hotel still stands today, remodeled and renovated. So people who have stayed there said the decision was macabre, but they experience the locations and they feel like a dark presence there. When you know what's happened in a place, you can feel like that part of it. And they say that the staff at the hotel are reluctant to discuss any of it, and they don't want to know about the dark history, which is crazy, really, because you would use it as a tourist attraction, personally. James Dockstater, January 1988, a 14-year-old Native American boy with dreams of a better life, Doc's data was lured within the promise of money at the bus stop by Dahmer. Dahmer, seeing his vulnerability, invited him to his grandmother's basement. In your nan's basement, bro! In an act of cold calculation, Dahmer strangled the young boy, later dismembering his body with the same detachment he had with previous white people, But what he did is he actually kept parts of Doc's data. It's just part of his need of possession and control over the other people. The family, they were left shattered. They were grappling with the loss of a child whose life was brutally cut short. Now, let's just pause here and realize he was 14 years old. That highlights, seriously, particularly troubling aspect of Dahmer's crimes. His targeting of, marginalized and vulnerable individuals, especially how young these men were and of color. Predominantly, his victims were all men of color. There's been criticism justified in my view that these victims received less attention and their cases less priority because of who they were, the color of their skin, the gay community. And this is something we really need to confront. Honestly, when examining this case, you got to think about that. So Richard Guerrero, March 24th, 1988. Guerrero, a 22-year-old Latino man seeking friendship, was drugged and strangled at Dahmer's grandmother's house. He was known for his charisma, his ambition, always striving to provide for his family. I want to speak about the victims and the positives about the victims. Let's know the victims. So again, methodical dismemberment and disposal of their remains. Spoke to his calculating and chilling approach. For the Guerrero family, this loss was compounded by the knowledge that Richard's trust and his openness were met with brutality. Anthony Sears, March 25th, 1989. Sears was a 24-year-old aspiring model, full of dreams and a bright future. Dahmer encountered him at a club, where the promise of companionship, friendship, turned sinister. After luring Sears to his grandmother's home, Dahmer strangled him, later preserving his skull and genitals as trophies. Pretty minging, really. This act of preservation was not just chilling, but reflective of Dahmer's deep-seated need to retain control over his victims. Now, for the Sears family, learning of this, it brought a mixture of sorrow and horror, as it would. But the thing I find particularly disturbing about the Sears case is that Dahmer committed this murder while living with his nan. Think about that, right? You're maintaining this facade of normalcy whilst harboring this horrendous secret under your nan's roof. I live with my nan. I love my nan. Surely, do they not sense something? I'm not saying she's in the wrong, but she must have sensed something. In interviews, she did complain about strange smells, noises from the basement, but can you really imagine your grandson's going to be out there killing men and cutting them up and keeping? And the fact that he can do this in his grandma's, it really says something about his psychological state even more. So in May 1990, Dahmer moved into an apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. This marks a new phase in his killing spree. His methods remained consistent, but the frequency of the killings increased dramatically, as did the horrific nature of his crimes. So, former residents of the Oxford apartments where Dahmer lived, let's say this building was demolished in 1992, but memories linger, all right? Neighbors described him as quiet and polite, the kind of guy who keeps to himself. This is a phrase we hear pretty repeatedly in these true crime cases, which makes me imagine, what are you missing out on in your daily interactions, your daily conversations? How many warning signs do we overlook by just thinking, respect their privacy, they're just a normal guy, non-unusual behavior? So in June 1990, Eddie Smith, he was a 28-year-old African-American man, full of life and potential, known for his love of music and vibrant personality. Again, Dahmer lured him to his apartment, where he was drugged and strangled. That's sort of his MO, drugged and strangled. He took photographs during the dismemberment process. This is what you see in the documentary a lot. He kept his skull as a trophy and felt a need to document and preserve. This is indicative of his compulsion to control and remember his victims and keep them with him. And just It was permanent. Smith's family, clearly they were left in devastation. They struggled with the stark reality of his disappearance and death. Now, September the 2nd, 1990, Ernest Miller, a 22-year-old African-American man who wanted to become a professional dancer. He met Dahmer outside a bookstore, enticed by the promise of money. All comes down to money. He was drugged again, strangled again, preserved his biceps and heart. Biceps is weird, but he put them in the fridge. This is just his fascination with the human body. This act changed his apartment into like a museum of horror. And again, for the Miller family, such a profound impact. There's a void that can never be filled. All of these families that are like, he's taking away, it's not just the victims, it's the families. But this is one person that Dahmer specifically selected for his physique, muscular and fit. He found it aesthetically pleasing. This selective targeting demonstrates sort of the predatory calculation behind his actions. He wasn't just killing indiscriminately. He was choosing victims based on specific criteria. This sort of adds another layer of like sketch to his crimes. You know, he's not just going anyone, he's choosing these people. So September 24th, 1990, David Thomas, a 23-year-old father and friend, he was lured by the prospect of earning some quick money. Known for his gentle nature and dedication to his family, Thomas was drugged and strangled by Dahmer. Dahmer took photographs of the dismemberment process, but chose not to preserve any of the parts. I guess this was maybe a shift in his motivations, but this is crazy because this was a family man. He was a father. Like the unimaginable grief of losing a loved one in such a brutal manner. So 18th of February, Curtis Straughter, 1991. He was a 19-year-old African-American. You see a trend here. Targeted at a bus stop. Again, see a trend here. With dreams of becoming a model, Dahmer lured him with promise of money and companionship once again. Once in Dahmer's apartment, Straughter was drugged and strangled. Dahmer kept his skull and his hands as trophies. Just further evidence of his twisted desire to retain parts of his victims. The Straughter family, they were left to mourn his loss. They struggled with the knowledge of the gruesome end, I'd imagine. April the 7th, 1991. Errol Lindsay, a 19-year-old African-American man, full of life and dreams, was lured by Dahmer with the promise of money. Lindsay soon became the subject of Dahmer's zombie experiment. So after drilling a hole in Lindsay's skull and injecting it with hydrochloric acid, now get this, he's trying to create zombies. He's drilling into their skull and injecting it with hydrochloric acid. Dahmer watched as he awoke, disorientated and in pain. Lindsay's eventual murder marked a disturbing escalation in Dahmer's method. Driven by a chilling desire to create sort of a compliant victim. He didn't want to be alone. He wanted them to be compliant, stay with him. Maybe if he succeeded with one, the others wouldn't have happened. I don't know. But this is like horrible fate. Imagine how Lindsay's family feel, like experimented on. Like it's just a tragic and senseless loss. Like the zombie experiment aspect of Dahmer's crimes reflects like a shift from just killing people, but trying to change his victims into someone who's going to change. That he's not trying to kill them. He wants to keep him with him. And it's like sexual sadism in a way. Now, experts explain this kind of escalation from murder to experimentation. Sort of, it's a progression that's really only seen in the most extreme cases. And what makes it super disturbing is that it just demonstrates how his fantasy life had completely overtaken any connection to reality. At this point, he's gone. He's gone. Like, there's no empathy, no reality. And like the ability to continue this killing spree for so long is contributed to various factors: charm, societal biases of the time. Black people, gay people, they weren't, unfortunately at the time they should have been. They were marginalized communities, and police often failed to act on reports, which was allowing him to operate unchecked, essentially. One critical occasion, a 14-year-old boy, Konorak Simphansomph, once escaped from Dahmer's apartment, but was returned to him by the police. They returned him to his apartment. They believed Dahmer's fabricated story of lovers' quarrel. This serious error by the police allowed Dahmer to continue his spree without consequence. I mean, if there's been interviews with former Milwaukee police officers who served during this period, that a lot of them are reluctant to speak clearly, but some of them are. And several of them acknowledge that the complaints from the gay community and communities of color weren't given the same weight, time as those from neighborhoods such as white and straight men. One retired detective has been on record and said, "We've missed opportunities. There's no denying that." This institutional failure is a crucial element of the Dahmer story, really, because that's what he went for. Did he know? We don't know. It really, but this prompted significant reforms in police procedures in the subsequent years. So back to the killings. Tony Hughes, May 24th, 1991. Hughes was a 31-year-old deaf-mute African-American man with a bright future, featured a lot on the documentary. So he was lured under the guise of posing for photographs. He was known for his creativity and determination. He was particularly vulnerable due to his inability to hear or speak. In Dahmer's apartment, he was strangled and his skull was retained as a trophy. The family, already grappling with communication challenges that what they've dealt with before to get him to the man he is, left to face the compounded grief of losing him in such a horrific manner. The story of Tony Hughes is especially heartbreaking. Imagine navigating the world without hearing or speaking. You're developing different strategies to connect with others. He's probably not got that extra ability to sense the negativity, the danger, in someone's voice. So what could he have been doing behind him, But his mother's became an advocate for both the deaf community and crime victims, transforming her grief into action. Her resilience in the face of such devastating loss is remarkable. Really. So, you'll remember this second name, Konorak Simpfansumpf, May 27th, 1991, was a 14-year-old Laotian boy who, after escaping and being returned by police, was killed and dismembered. His skull was found in Dahmer's apartment, further highlighting the tragic consequences of systematic failures. Family, having placed their trust in the authorities, were left to grapple with their profound loss and the preventable nature of Konorak's death. The Simpfansumpf, I'm going to call them the Simp family. It just represents like the biggest failure in the system, really. He escaped and they took him back. Like, how can you return a drugged, bleeding 14-year-old boy to this apartment? Like, Dahmer's previously been convicted of sexually assaulting his older brother. Bear that in mind. How is this not readily available to the officers? He was convicted of sexually assaulting this guy's older brother. But this did lead to the officers' dismissal. They were later reinstated on appeal, and that did spark a lot of controversy. So, June 30th, 1991, Matt Turner, 20-year-old African-American again, man, dreams of making it in the city, was picked up at Chicago bus station. Known for his artistic talents, ambition, Turner was drugged and strangled. Shock by Dahmer, who kept his head and internal organs this time. Weird as trophies. Internal organs. Yeah, I mean, the family just, this devastating reality of his disappearance and death, struggled to comprehend the brutality of his end. Jeremiah Weinberger, July the 5th. Look how many there are. 1991. Weinberger, a 23-year-old Latino man from Chicago, was lured from a bar under the pretense of a weekend getaway. He's trying everything. Known for his warm personality and love for life, Weinberger was subjected to the same zombie experiment. Oh, this again. After 2 days of enduring Dahmer's twisted machinations, he was killed and dismembered. Now, again, we're trying to talk a lot about the families, how they feel. For the Weinberger family, the knowledge of Jeremiah's suffering, experimentation, was just a haunting burden. I find it particularly disturbing about this case is the extended duration of his suffering. like usually his victims were killed, left, dead, done. Now listen, that's bad enough, but it's quick, you know. But 2 days of torment, that's a difference. What went through his head during these 2 days? What went through Dahmer's head during these 2 days? Was he growing more sadistic, or was he trying to genuinely just attempt to have a permanent companion? Because this is what it's all about. It's all about him having a companion. But it's a crazy, profound depth of his pathology. July 12th, 1991, Oliver Lacey, a 23-year-old African-American again, aspirations and a zest for life, that's how he's described, was known for his athleticism and his charisma. Dahmer, using his usual manipulations, lured Lacey to his apartment where he drugged and strangled. Dahmer took photographs and preserved Lacey's heart in the refrigerator. Again, just ritualistic behavior. Let's talk about this. It's just vile, man. So the Lacey family, overwhelmed by grief, they face the chilling details of Oliver's death with bravery and resilience. Joseph Bradhoft, July 19th, 1991. The final victim, Bradhoft, was a 25-year-old white man who was a father and a friend, known for his kind-hearted nature, strangled and left on Dahmer's bed for 2 days. He was eventually decapitated. His head was stored in the refrigerator, bro. But this marked the end of his horrific killing spree. Let's talk about the Bradhofts. The family, like so many others, were left to endure the pain of loss and the haunting details of Joseph's demise. By this point, his killing spree, Dahmer's apartment had become the house of horrors in the most literal sense. Police would later document the overwhelming smell of decomposition that permeated the building. His neighbors moaned. Like, this does raise questions. So how his neighbors, like, they didn't report it? It's an obvious sign. The stench, the noises is super wrong. How are they not reporting this? People who have spoke with forensic doctors or odor experts, they can explain that people become desensitized to smells over time. It doesn't smell like that to you, you know? But imagine being that neighbor years down the line and you're like, oh. This came on July 22nd, 1991. Tracy Edwards, he managed to escape Dahmer's grasp. Edwards, a 32-year-old, again, African-American man, was lured by the promise of money for posing for photographs. Once in Dahmer's apartment, Edwards realized the sinister intentions behind the invitation. Dahmer attempted to restrain him by placing a handcuff on his wrist, but Edwards, fueled by adrenaline and fear, he managed to break free. In a desperate bid for survival, he fled the apartment, flagging down 2 police officers on the street. Edwards led them back where they encountered a scene of unimaginable horror. Can you imagine walking into that apartment? Tracy Edwards' story is one of extraordinary courage and survival instinct. Tragically, his life after escaping Dahmer was troubled. He struggled with homelessness and had several brushes with the police. The trauma of his encounter with Dahmer, it cast a long shadow over his life, demonstrating how the impact of such events extends more. It's just beyond the immediate danger, the families, the people involved. It's a reminder that survivors too can carry profound scars, survivors' guilt, even when they escape, you know. So, inside the apartment, police discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, a 57-gallon drum filled with acid and various body parts stored in the refrigerator and the freezer. The apartment was filled with the stench of decay and it's a testament to just how minging it was, really. It's just gruesome. That, like, in those walls, what's gone on is disgusting. The discovery finally brought Dahmer's reign of terror to an end, revealing the full extent of his horrific crimes. Some people have interviewed the officers, and decades later, he struggles to describe what he saw. He said, it was like walking into a nightmare. And like in his interview, his voice is still a little bit shaky, like at the memory. The officers who responded to that scene suffered significant psychological trauma. Several required extensive therapy, and at least one left the force entirely. This secondary trauma affecting those who confront the aftermath of such crime is often overlooked in many discussions of these sorts of cases. Dahmer's arrest was a media sensation, and his trial drew significant public attention. During the proceedings, the courtroom was a gallery of emotions and testimonies as witnesses shared their harrowing accounts. Members of the victims' families courageously took to the stand, offering poignant and heart-wrenching testimonies. Their words brought to life the vibrant personalities and aspirations of the victims, highlighting the devastating impact of Dahmer's actions. The media coverage of Dahmer's trial was problematic in many ways. There's hundreds of newspaper articles and TV reports, all from that period, and there is a clear sensationalization in much of the reporting. It's all focused on the murder porn, the gruesome details, while reducing these victims to mere statistics. That's why I want to talk about their names, everything about them, and what their families could possibly feel. It's common in the true crime coverage, and it's something that we're trying to avoid in this podcast by highlighting who these men were in life and not just how they died. The prosecution presented a chilling array of evidence, including Dahmer's own confessions, which detailed his gruesome methods and the twisted motivations behind his crimes. Dr. Park Dietz, a prominent forensic psychiatrist, testified that Dahmer was not insane, but profoundly disturbed, driven by fantasies of power and control. The defense, meanwhile, argued for Dahmer's insanity, shock, pointing to his mental health issues and inability to control his impulses. It's a blurry line between legal sanity and profound mental disturbance, right? He clearly knew his actions, they were wrong. He took precautions to avoid detection. Yet his mental processes were disturbed, unquestionably disturbed at that. So the tension between knowing the right from wrong, being driven by overwhelming urges, it's that many forensic psychiatric debates today probably go on, right? Dahmer himself expressed a level of remorse during the trial, acknowledging the horror of his actions. In a statement to the court, he said, here we go, "I knew I was sick, or evil, or both. Now, I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace." That was a really bad accent, I do apologize. Hey guys. However, his words offered little solace to the victims' families, who were left to grapple with their profound loss. People say they found Dahmer's expressions of remorse difficult to evaluate. Was he genuine, or was this just manipulation? When you look at his full confession tapes, which I've looked at as part of the research and writing down the notes, there are little bits where he does seem disturbed by his own actions. This is all on Netflix. Yet other times where he's describing these bits and bobs, with detachment, clinical detachment. It speaks to the psychological makeup that allowed him to commit such evil atrocities whilst maintaining a veneer of normalcy in his life. The trial concluded with Judge Lawrence Graham Jr. sentencing Dahmer to 15 consecutive life terms, sparing him the death penalty due to Wisconsin's abolition of capital punishment. He should have been killed, man. He did anyway. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Graham noted the calculated and heinous nature of Dahmer's crimes, emphasizing the need for justice and the protection of society. The trial also included emotional outbursts from the victims' families, who expressed their anger, which you'd be fucking fuming, and grief in poignant and raw testimonies. One of the most memorable moments came when Rita Isbell, the sister of victim Errol Lindsay, confronted Dahmer directly in court, her voice shaking with emotion as she implored him to confront the pain he had caused. Rita Isbell's testimony remains one of the most powerful moments in criminal court history. I've seen the footage a fair bit while doing the research. Her raw emotion is just, it's there. You can see it's obviously they're all raw and emotional, but it's just like, but she does speak about this and says after that confrontation in the courtroom, she does feel a form of release, and the justice system, for all its flaws, can provide a form of release for victims' families. It allows them to express their pain and their rage in ways that contribute to their sort of healing process. So in prison, Dahmer's life took on a different yet equally complex dimension. Isolated by the nature of his crimes, he reportedly expressed remorse and sought solace in religion, undergoing a form of spiritual conversion. I don't know if I believe this, but here we go. So this period of introspection opened a new chapter in his life, marked by attempts at redemption and reconciliation with his past. Now, Dahmer's religious conversion in prison, was it genuine, or was it simply just another way for him to cope with his circumstances? Don't get me wrong, faith can be a powerful force for change, transformation, but it's difficult not to be skeptical given his history, like Dahmer's history of manipulation. The prison minister who worked with him believed his conversion was sincere, describing noticeable changes in his demeanor and outlook. Now, was his true redemption? I don't know. That's a question for philosopher majors and theologians. Dahmer's time in prison was marked by a curious mix of notoriety and introspection. Despite his heinous crimes, he became somewhat of a celebrity among true crime enthusiasts like me. I love it. I've watched all the documentaries. I've seen it all. I love it. Not him, but I'm just fascinated by true crime, hence why I'm doing this. This attention led to numerous correspondences with people from the outside the prison, including pen pals who sought to understand the mind behind the monster. Some of the correspondences were later shared with the public, providing a glimpse into Dahmer's thoughts and reflections during his incarceration. Now, the phenomenon of people write into infamous like killers, Bundys, your Dahmers, all this, it's something that I've looked at online a little bit. We've spoken about on the podcast before. It's called, I learned this, hybristophilia, and it's an attraction to those who commit violent crimes. It raises a few questions about people's psychology. Why are we drawn to darkness? What makes people seek connection? We've tried to discuss this previously. I don't know, but they've committed unimaginable crimes, and yet we still want to talk to them. It's a complex relationship with us and evil, and us wanting to understand evil, So, people who came forward with stories about Dahmer was his father, Lionel. He wrote a book titled A Father's Story. In it, he candidly reflected on his son's life, grappling with the questions and how and why Jeffrey became the man he did. Lionel's book offers a poignant and personal perspective, exploring the complex relationship between father and son and the haunting legacy of Jeffrey's actions. Lionel Dahmer's book is one of the most heart-wrenching accounts some people say they've ever read. I'm not read it. It's a father trying to reconcile the boy he raised with the monster his son became. It's what people are saying. There's a passage where Lionel describes looking through old family photos, trying to find a sign or an indicator of what was to come. This is sort of a reminder that killers don't exist in isolation. They leave behind families who try somehow make sense of their actions. They carry the weight of being the father, the mother. The media frenzy surrounding Dahmer's crimes also inspired numerous documentaries and books, each attempting to dissect his psyche. Here we are trying to do this and unravel the mysteries of his motivations. Authors and filmmakers delved into dark corners of Dahmer's life, interviewing those who knew him and studied his case, each contributing to the ongoing discourse about his life and his crimes. The constant stream of content about Dahmer, it really raises I'm doing this, but it does raise ethical questions about our fascination with true crime. Where's the line between education and exploitation? Like, this is something I thought about when creating this side of the podcast. Like, behind each detail is seriously a person still grieving their loved one. But I do believe there's value in understanding these cases. They tell us important things about human psychology and social failures, right? But we've also got to understand, and this is what I've tried to do, is not lose sight of the real people behind these stories, the victims and the families, because that's what we should be focusing on. So former inmates who crossed paths with Dahmer during his time in prison have shared their stories, painting a picture of a man who, despite his notoriety, lived a life marked by routine and contemplation behind bars. Some described him as quiet and reserved, while others noted his unsettling sense of humour, which often hinted at the darkness that still lingered within him. Dahmer's life came to a violent end. Not violent enough, but violent enough, On the 28th of November 1994, he was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Big up Scarver. Scarver later claimed that Dahmer's behaviour, including making jokes about cannibalism, provoked the fatal attack. I think he was paid. Dahmer's death marked the end of a life that had been both a source of fascination and horror. For me, you, the public. Corrections officers who worked at the facility where Dahmer died said many staff had predicted something like this would happen. His fame, notoriety made him a bit of a target, and his behavior did little to help this situation. There's been speculation that Dahmer may have welcomed death, that his expressions of remorse were genuine, and the weight of his actions had become too much to bear. But we'll never know for certain. It's just, the human mind is so complex, man. Like, the psychology, it's even in those people who commit like these horrendous, horrific, disturbing acts, it's still, you don't know what's going on in there. But the impact of Dahmer's crimes were profound, leaving an indelible mark on victims, families, and society at large. His case prompted critical discussions on societal biases, law enforcement practices, and the need for improved mental health awareness and support. It also underscored the failures in the system that allowed Dahmer to continue his spree for so long, highlighting the importance of listening to marginalized communities and addressing their concerns as well, and doing it earnestly. People find it interesting in Milwaukee how like the city grappled with this dark chapter of history. The site where his apartment building stood is just now an empty lot. Deliberately, it's left undeveloped, and essentially this is done out of respect for the victims. Nearby residents have created informal memorials, and community organizations work to honor the memories of those who were lost. Now, this is a powerful example of how communities can acknowledge painful histories whilst focusing on healing and prevention. Reflecting on the psychological insights into Dahmer's behavior, experts emphasize the importance of early intervention and recognizing warning signs and understanding his struggle with sexuality, identity, and his own identity. And it just adds to another layer of complexities of his character. People who have spoke with like FBI behavioral analysts, they were just like struck by how much understanding of warning signs has evolved since Dahmer's time to today. The combination of animal cruelty and the fascination with death, severe social isolation, and escalating substance abuse would nowadays trigger intervention. It would be recognized, it would be reported. It really underscores the importance of education about these like warning signs, and not to stigmatize those who struggle with mental health issues, but to connect with them and support them before. I'm not saying everyone's going to do this, but if you got him before this, you may have been able to prevent it. Dahmer's life was a tragic convergence of psychological dysfunction. And yeah, he just went through like so much. Like, I really like unmet needs, societal failures. Like, this case really remains one of the most thoroughly documented in criminal history. It does offer valuable insights into the development of serial offenders, but also serving as a stark reminder of systematic issues that allowed his crimes to continue undetected for so long. The question for me is nature versus nurture. And this always inevitably arises when examining, especially Dahmer. His father Lionel described certain odd behaviors in his childhood. But there was nothing that definitively predicted the horrific path he would take. But it does raise uncomfortable questions about how much of Dahmer's pathology was inherent and how much was shaped by his environment. People have said that his father had weird urges when they were a kid. People like development psychologists about this, like on this case, and they highlight what they call the perfect storm. And this is factors potential genetic predispositions, early fascination with animal dissection, profound social isolation, unresolved sexual conflicts, and alcohol dependence. Like, none of these aspects alone would typically create someone like Dahmer, but together it's like the perfect shit mix. It's so fertile for just his disturbing fantasies to take root and manifest into reality. And like the progression of his crimes, like his first murder of Stephen Hicks, it appears to have been somewhat impulsive, driven by fear, abandonment of when he wanted to leave. But like the rest of the killings, they show like more planning, ritualization, and elaboration of his fantasies. Now, this pattern is something forensic psychologists now watch for when assessing potentially dangerous individuals. The families of Dahmer's victims have faced unimaginable grief, compounded by the gruesome details of their loved ones. Now, they're hearing about this all the time. Not still, but like your Netflix documentaries, But a lot of them are doing things through advocacy, forgiveness, and just trying to keep the memories of their loved ones alive. But they're seeing all these documentaries, man. That would be fucking horrible. Like, you've lost a family member and all you're seeing is these documentaries coming out and people doing this. And I'm sorry to them, but I've tried to name your victims, okay? I'm sorry. But it for me was the systematic, like the police didn't get involved enough, and they really have to change that, because such profound loss would not have been happening if police were not effectively racist and effectively homophobic. The black and the LGBTQ plus communities. Now, listen, I don't but homophobes and racists, right? They were essentially in the shadows back then, and it's not good. But it's disgusting that the fact the police didn't treat them like they would have treated a straight white male or a straight white woman. Luckily nowadays this is something that is not there. Police departments, police everywhere around the world, they've really significantly reformed. And is that the case of Dahmer part of this? We don't know. But they have got specialized units. They focus on vulnerable populations. They've revised their mission, like the mission persons protocols, and developed like comprehensive training programs designed to address implicit biases. So that's good. But the painful lessons from this case have led to tangible improvement, which is, again, good. In like similar situations, they are handled better today. Now, perhaps one of the most important lessons from the Dahmer case is the danger of isolation, both for potential perpetrators and potential victims, because everyone was isolated. Dahmer's profound disconnection from others allowed his dark fantasies to flourish, unchecked, while the social isolation of many of his victims made them particularly vulnerable to his manipulation, because they just weren't shown the love that they thought he could give, I guess. Like, imagine you're black and gay in these communities back then. People aren't showing your attention. A white man, a gay man comes up to you, he's showing your attention, you're going to like it, But there were clear signs in Dahmer as a child: his fascination with dead animals, his increase in alcohol dependency, his social withdrawal. At these signs, they did go largely unaddressed. And it allows his pathology to deepen and intensify over time. The media's role in cases like Dahmer's deserves particular scrutiny as well. Initial reporting often emphasized the sensational aspects of his crimes whilst dehumanizing his victims, which is something I've tried not to do today. The tendency to focus on the killer rather than those whose lives were cut short remains. It's problematic and it is common, and I know, but you can only go so much. I'm trying to be mindful of this throughout this episode. Now, this is beta alpha testing, so, please bear with me on all of this. But I do want to take a moment to address something important. There is countless photographs, police reports, and trial documents. Some of these materials are extremely graphic, and I've made the decision not to put them in the video and not go into too much murder porn. There is a fine line between sort of talking about a case and giving that murder porn and exploiting it. And I don't feel the need to dwell on all of those like horrific bits and bobs. So, rather the psychology, and it still remains complex. While Dahmer exhibited elements of psychopathy, particularly in his ability to compartmentalize and his lack of empathy towards his victims, it doesn't fit neatly into any single category from what I'm reading online. His necrophilic tendencies, cannibalistic practices, and preservation of body parts suggest a unique pathology that continues to challenge like the understanding of that extreme criminal behavior. But there is Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who people have consulted with. She described Dahmer as having a constellation of paraphilias, multiple sexual disorders that became increasingly intertwined with power, control, and death. His desire to create zombies through crude lobotomy attempts reveals a fantasy of complete possession that transcended mere physical control. What makes Dahmer particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is his awareness of his own disturbed thoughts. Unlike many serial offenders who externalize blame, Dahmer acknowledged the wrongness of his desires, but claimed he couldn't control them. This raises complex questions about moral responsibility and the nature of compulsive behavior. Since Dahmer's death, technological advances have dramatically changed how similar cases would be investigated. Today, DNA analysis, digital surveillance systems, and just an improved database, integrated database between like police systems would make it way more difficult for someone to commit like a series of murders without detection. You can't do that nowadays. It's not going to run out of content soon. However, the human elements that failed in Dahmer's case is biases, communication breakdowns, and dismissed concerns from especially like marginalized communities. They will remain challenges that people will continue to face. And also back then, like the geography of Dahmer's crimes, they like do reveal important patterns. Like he primarily hunted in areas where he felt comfortable, like your gay bars, your bus stations, your shopping malls, all near his home. Localized activity is consistent, but back then the police didn't notice it because they weren't talking to each other. But the criminologists call this a comfort zone pattern. There we go, where perpetrators operate within familiar territory. Today, geographic profiling uses these patterns to help identify potential suspects in similar cases. In revisiting this case, we also must acknowledge that behind each clinical analysis and a psychological theory are real people whose lives were violently cut short. Each of Dahmer's victims had hopes, dreams, and loved ones. They were sons, brothers, friends, and partners whose absence continue to be felt decades later. The victims' families have expressed mixed feelings about the ongoing public fascination with Dahmer. Some have used the attention to advocate for change, while others have requested privacy and space to heal. And you've got to respect both approaches and recognize that there is no single right way to process such trauma. Time has provided some perspective on this case, but it hasn't diminished its impact. For those directly affected, the pain remains fresh. For those of us studying it, the lessons remain relevant. And for society as a whole, the name Jeffrey Dahmer continues to evoke profound discomfort, and it's a reminder of the darkness that can exist within human nature. Now, as we finish this little episode on Dahmer's life, his crimes, I do want to emphasize that understanding is not the same as excusing. We can acknowledge the complex factors that contributed to his development while still holding him fully accountable for his actions. The value in studying cases like this lies in our ability to recognize similar patterns early and potentially prevent future tragedies. I'd like to end with a quote from the mother of one of Dahmer's victims. "Remember my son for how he lived, not just how he died." That is a brilliant sentiment. It should guide their approach to watching anything like this. By honouring the victims, by acknowledging their humanity, ensuring their stories aren't overshadowed by the notoriety of their killer. Now, thank you for joining me for this first episode of Deadly Discussions in the Let's Get Chatting podcast. Now, that has all been read off script, I understand, but we are trying something new. I hope you liked it. Please like and comment how you feel about this episode, and please support us by subscribing, commenting, liking, and sharing. If you like true crime, let me know. Comment and we'll do more of this. Maybe not on my own next time, but hey, we're trying something new. Hope you like it. Peace out. Stay sexy.